All right, this is lesson 2.3a, The Journey to the Americas. This is also the start of a two-part lesson, which will continue tomorrow. And in this one, we're going to talk about the experience of enslaved Africans after being captured until their arrival at plantations or other points of servitude in the Americas. I feel like I should start this lesson with a trigger warning because the conditions we're going to see were extremely harsh and absolutely dehumanizing and involve upsetting themes, including torture and rape. Nonetheless, it's important that we establish this pattern of dehumanization as part of the historical record of transatlantic slavery from the very beginning. We're not going to act as slavery apologists here by pretending it was any less horrifying than it was. And I'll add a quote here from famous African American author and poet Maya Angelou that I think is highly relevant to this lesson. She said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." So it's in that spirit of courage that we will confront some ugly and upsetting truths about the treatment of those Africans who were forcibly transported to this part of the world and who are the ancestors of many African Americans today. By the early 1500s, a pattern of global trade had developed in the Atlantic Ocean that's sometimes called the triangular trade system because it basically had three main points. The first leg of the triangle was the transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas, and this is an essential part of our lesson today. We know that most of these captives were then forced to labor in the Americas in order to provide profit for Europeans, and that often involved working on plantations to produce cash crops like sugar. Now, there's kind of a random accident of chemistry here that made this even more profitable for Europe. See, it turns out that when you process sugar cane, you get sugar, of course, but you also get a byproduct, this sticky, dark syrup called molasses. Molasses is an inferior sweetener, but when subjected to a chemical process called distillation, it turns into alcohol, specifically rum. And rum turned out to be extremely valuable and was even used as a form of payment by European slave traders in Africa. This meant that the more enslaved Africans were purchased, the more sugar was grown and the more rum could be produced, which was then used to buy more people, to grow more sugar, to make more rum, and so on and so forth in a never ending cycle. And this is how the system ended up consuming the lives of at least 12 million Africans. In the rest of this lesson, we'll look at the experience of those Africans, especially on the second part of their journey, what's known as the Middle Passage, the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. For most, the journey started deep in the interior of the African continent, in the tropical rainforests or the savannas, where rival groups who were at war with each other would sell prisoners into slavery. This was not a new practice, but by the 1500s, more and more African kingdoms were armed with European guns, and European demand for slave labor had increased the price of these captives, giving them more incentive to raid neighboring communities and take prisoners. After they were sold, captive Africans would have been force marched to the coast, a journey that could have taken several months, during which men, women, and children were chained together, often by the neck, and held at gunpoint by armed slave traders. Those who resisted or who were too weak to continue would have been killed. At this point, it's worth asking how we know anything about the conditions of this journey. And the answer is that of the 12.5 million people forced to endure it, a very small handful ultimately had the chance to learn to read and write and publish their stories. The most complete of those accounts was written by a man named Oloda Equiano, who was captured at the age of 11 and wrote the most comprehensive known narrative of an enslaved person who was actually transported from Africa. Much of what we know about the abuse enslaved Africans suffered comes from his autobiography. Oloda Equiano described emerging from the rainforest to the coast and seeing the ocean for the first time in his life. He described his astonishment upon seeing the huge European ships and his horror at seeing Black people held in filthy, overcrowded cages and dungeons. Thanks to Equiano, we know that African prisoners were subjected to brutal beatings and invasive medical examination at ports of departure and arrival. but it is his description of the ship itself that is most disturbing. He reported being violently manhandled and forced below deck into the hold of the ship. The conditions below decks can only be described as hellish, with bodies chained together and stacked such that there was barely room to breathe. It is well documented that slave traders packed their ships as full as possible in order to maximize their profits. Equiano wrote that, amid the cacophony of screaming, sobbing, pleading, and praying in a multitude of languages, the stench of death and the sound of human misery overwhelmed him, and that he collapsed and fainted. This almost unthinkable ordeal would have lasted as long as 3 months. It was called the Middle Passage because it was the second leg of the three-part journey that started with the forced march from Central Africa. While Olaudah Equiano's account is the best-known narrative of the Middle Passage, it is not the only one. Another enslaved man, Otoba Cugoano, corroborated Equiano's story, describing the conditions as so miserable that those imprisoned with him aboard one ship agreed to attempt to blow it up and perish together in the flames. Certainly, a unanimous vote to die by fire suggests desperation and implies that the trauma suffered by captive Africans aboard slave ships constituted one of the most extreme forms of mass torture in the history of the world. Of course, there was resistance. And in one case in 1839, the crew was overpowered and the captain was killed. But more often, those who resisted were killed by heavily armed crewmen, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. It was often the case that enslaved people jumped overboard on purpose when they got the chance, preferring drowning to the suffering on board. Equiano himself attested that, despite his natural fear of the water, he would have cast himself into the sea had he not been shackled to the deck. In spite of the torturous and inhuman conditions of the Middle Passage, 85% of those who had been taken from Africa survived the journey to the Americas. Upon arriving in North America, they would have been quarantined and resold at port cities like Charleston, South Carolina, and then forced to march to plantations or other points of servitude belonging to whomever had purchased them. Until the 1770s, slavery was legal everywhere in the British colonies of mainland North America, and this final passage of the journey might have taken as long as the first and middle passages combined. Those who made it to the end found themselves forced into a life of back-breaking servitude and hard labor from which there was no obvious escape. Deprived of their freedom and human dignity, they nonetheless built the economic foundation of the United States, and as time went on, they distinguished themselves in many ways and asserted their humanity against crushing systems of oppression. In our next lesson, we will meet a young woman who, captured from Africa as an infant, went on to become a world-famous poet, a true testament to Maya Angelou's sentiment that history, despite its wrenching pain, need not be relived if faced with courage. More to come.